Welcome to the Affiliated Monitors Expert Podcast, hosted by Tom Fox on the Compliance Podcast Network. Today, we are going to explore what is ethical culture and why does it matter. Eric, first of all, thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
My pleasure.
Eric, we've had a lot of conversations from some very high-ranking Department of Justice officials and officials at the Securities and Exchange Commission talking about culture, talking about corporate culture. So, for instance, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein talked at Compliance Week about the need for corporate culture. We had Charles Kane from the Securities and Exchange Commission talking about corporate culture. We had Jay Clayton, the commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission, talking about corporate culture. We typically don't have the number one at the SEC and the number two at the Justice Department talking about corporate culture. But that's something you've been talking about for quite some time. So I was wondering if we could just start with your views on why corporate culture matters.
Sure. I think to understand why government officials and enforcement are starting to talk more about culture, you got to ask the question, what is it? And I'm an old career auditor, and I used to hear the term culture and think it was some kind of a social science concept that you couldn't measure. And so I didn't pay it much attention. As I started doing the kind of work I do now, which is monitoring and going into companies and assessing their ethics and compliance, it became pretty clear that culture is everything. Culture is, the way I look at it, a foundational internal control without which all your other controls are likely to be less effective. What that generally means is this. Culture is the way things really work within an organization, within a company. You can have all kinds of rules and regulations and policies and procedures, but the real behavior of employees and organizations throughout a company, that is culture. That is the way things work. Typically, it's reflective of the core values of the company. But that's only if the company spends the time and effort and know-how to operationalize those core values throughout the organization.
Eric, many of the people that both you and I work with are multinational organizations. And as difficult as it may be to find one culture in the United States, it's going to be exponentially more difficult to have one culture across an international organization, even if that organization has an English-only language policy. So how do you first identify the subcultures within a single organization and then try to infuse some basic or one basic culture in that organization?
Well, you can't force one uniform culture throughout an entire organization because you're dealing with different inputs. Culture is made up of all the different people that work for that organization, which means that it's going to differ by necessity based on population and geography. If you're dealing with even parts of a company in various cities in the United States will have different cultures, never mind operating in various parts of the world. That's going to impact how people look at things, how they behave, how they view the rules in their company and the need to comply. And that really is the linkage between culture and compliance, is that it drives ethical behavior. Also, every employee that you hire, every merger and acquisition that you might have that brings another culture into your organization has the tendency to change it. And you want to have a change for the better, not the worse. You want to bring in a culture that is positive, a culture that is committed to integrity and ethics. That's why M&A due diligence is so critical. because you don't want to dilute the culture of the organization. Cultural systems, there are different kinds of cultural systems that impact a company, and a lot of it has to do with location, language, rituals. Heroes and role models are another informal mechanism for building a particular culture that is committed to doing the right thing. And although you have subcultures throughout an organization and throughout the world within your single company, the key is to have some overarching key themes of that culture being consistent with the core values. Things like integrity, ethical behavior, serving your customers and stakeholders, speaking up. Having a speak up culture is a critical aspect of having a strong ethical culture. But then you also have formal cultural systems and processes which also impact culture. Things like your hiring process and who you hire and how you do it, how you train people, what the performance management systems are like, and whether they're consistent with the culture and incentivizing the right kind of behavior. And do you hold people accountable for building that culture? Interestingly, though, people always talk about tone at the top. That implies that there's a need to ensure the right kind of culture in the organization. But tone at the top is no longer enough. And kind of underscoring some of the enforcement chatter lately about culture is a belief that tone at the top is not enough. You have to have tone at the top, mood in the middle, and buzz at the bottom of the organization. Because people in a company are influenced more greatly by their immediate managers in small groups than they are by a kind of a faceless CEO that might be 5,000 miles away.
Eric, how do you, we'll get into some of the assessments Affiliated Monitors does in a later episode, but is it, when you go into a company, is it clear to you, or is it obvious when a company has not aligned the espoused culture with the core values at the bottom of the organization?
Yeah, it is. It's pretty clear, and in fact, we've gotten so used to doing these kinds of assessments that it really doesn't take long for us to figure out that there is a disconnect, a misalignment between what the organization says in its core values and what it does and what its employees think. And critical in that, and we'll get into that later when we talk about assessment, it's very simple. Talk to the employees. And it is interesting to me how little C-suite leaders know about their organizations and their culture. They know what they like it to be. They know what they aspire it to be. Nobody wants a negative culture. No one wants an unethical culture. But they don't talk to their employees. And without talking to employees on a regular basis, you don't know how messages are being received and whether there are mixed messages coming from leaders, managers, and supervisors throughout the company.
So, Eric, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time today, but I've been visiting with Eric Feldman. We've been taking an introduction into what is an ethical culture and why does it matter. Eric, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you enjoyed this episode of AMI, the Expert podcast series. I hope you'll join us again next week where we explore another topic with a managing director of Affiliated Monitors. The podcast series is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.